was March 5th, 2015. The adventure begins. My favorite Thomas and Friends special had just been released on March 3rd. I was proud of myself for helping with it. That day, I was browsing through a bunch of documents about the show when I discovered one called Thomas and the Unfinished Bridge. Restricted. This got me confused. See, I kept track of all of the Thomas and Friends episodes, and I knew that there wasn't one called Thomas and the Unfinished Bridge. I asked my boss about this document. "Oh, that?" he asked, seeming slightly concerned. In 1986, an episode was going to be made called Thomas and the Unfinished Bridge. But it never aired on TV. "Why not?" I asked. From what I was told, it was supposed to be a regular episode. It was supposed to be the finale of the show's second season. Thomas was doing something normal, and his brakes began to fail. He was going towards an unfinished bridge with a bunch of passengers inside a coach he was pulling. Luckily, Edward saw this and managed to stop Thomas by coupling up to the coach and applying his brakes. Somebody working at the company made a draft of the episode and sent it to the show's main creators in a VHS tape. I think the guy's name was Eric? Yeah. The company noticed some things in the draft and fired the person who made it and canceled the entire episode. But why? I asked again. "We don't even know, and we don't want to either," my boss answered. "And what happened to the VHS tape?" "I've been told that the company kept it, but it was stolen by somebody. Nobody knows where it went," he said. When I got home that same day, I searched Amazon for anything called Thomas and the Unfinished Bridge. And surprisingly enough, I actually found an old VHS tape with that name being sold by an account which had a username, I guess you could call it. I really don't know, because it was just a bunch of random characters. Letters and numbers, specifically. Regardless, I ordered the VHS tape, and it took 8 days for the tape to arrive before it finally did on the 13th. Friday the 13th, what an odd coincidence. Yeah, I get it. Well, I connected my VCR to my TV and inserted the tape into the player. And I was met with nothing. Specifically, no title screen. Instead, the episode just started. This was understandable, because apparently the tape contained a draft. It started off normally enough, with a shot of Thomas chugging through a forest happily, carrying a coach full of passengers behind him. There were two things that were slightly odd, though. First off, there was no narration, even though there is narration in practically every other episode of the show. Secondly, instead of pulling Annie and Clarabelle like he'd usually do while transporting passengers, he was pulling a green express coach. The episode then showed Thomas approaching a station, presumably the one where he would drop off the passengers. He tried to apply his brakes, and they failed. That's exactly what my boss said was supposed to happen. Thomas went straight through the station, unable to stop, as the people on the station gave confused looks. The classic runaway theme used in the show during situations similar to these started playing, and next there was a shot of the front of Thomas. There was a scared expression on his face. It showed him passing a sign reading, "Danger! Engines must not pass this board," similar to the one seen in the 25th episode of the first season, Down the Mine. This episode was already slightly intense for children, but it didn't seem too bad yet. Then there was a shot of the passengers inside the coach, all screaming in terror. A wide shot showed Thomas passing a siding where Edward was resting. Edward noticed what was happening and sped onto the track, going towards Thomas. And soon we got to the coach. However, since it was a coach, there was no one there to couple Edward up to it, and you could see why this would be a serious problem. There was another shot of the inside of the coach with more screams. There was an extremely wide shot showing Thomas getting dangerously close to the unfinished bridge. His driver said, "The brakes are working again." And by far, that was the only speaking line in the entire episode besides the screams. It then showed Thomas. He was probably supposed to apply his brakes, but he didn't. The runaway theme began to slow down and became lower in pitch. And he plunged straight over the side of the bridge with the coach. I saw Edward brake behind him, just before he went over too. Thomas and the coach landed on a bunch of rocks, getting battered before falling into a stream. There was one more shot of the inside of the coach, now half submerged in water. Dead bodies were everywhere. The screen faded to static for about 10 seconds before a scene was then shown of Edward watching in terror as Sir Topham Hatt used a blowtorch to take off a now broken and battered Thomas's face, which showed an expression of pure pain and horror. Tears were running down his cheeks. Sir Topham Hatt took off his face, which immediately became lifeless, and threw it into a nearby pool of molten metal. "You deserved this. And much, much more," Topham said angrily. It showed Edward was at the smelter's yard, pushing a flatbed of Thomas's remains towards a giant metal claw hanging from the ceiling. "Goodbye, Thomas. I never expected it to end like this, but it did," Edward murmured. I watched as the claw came down and grabbed Thomas's remains. It pulled him upward and dropped him into the huge pool of molten metal. He melted in the pool, on screen. His face melted last, which was horrifying enough. And the last shot of the episode showed Edward leaving the smelter's yard with a depressed expression on his face. I took the VHS tape out of the VCR and snapped it in half. Nobody would ever see this horrific excuse for an episode again. Later, I noticed that the username of the Amazon account which sold me the tape wasn't just random letters and numbers. I had an epiphany that it was something encoded in base 64, an encoding scheme that converted words into random letters, numbers, and sometimes other characters. After running the username through a base 64 decoder, it came out as a URL for a website. And when I visited the website, it was just a couple of sentences written on a blank page. But those sentences scared me. Children need to know what really happens in the world. I'll make sure it's not hidden from them.